So the National Conference of Mayors is looking at ways they might react to the high-profile string of police-involved deaths. Mayor Karen Freeman-Wilson is chairing the U.S. Conference of Mayors Working Group of Mayors and Police Chiefs. We have her here now. Mayor, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, what made you decide to want to take on this assignment?
Well, first, when the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors calls you, Kevin Johnson, and the longtime executive director, Tom Cochran, also a former mayor, ask you to do something, then it's hard to say no. And in this instance, I would not and did not want to say no. I thought it was something that was extremely important for communities across the country and something that I thought I had a level of understanding about that I could add to the discussion.
Since we've seen these very high-profile deaths and then protests starting this summer in Missouri, have you changed the way you've done things in Gary?
No, because for the most part, we had really instituted community policing some 15 years ago in the city of Gary. And certainly we have cops officers, but increasingly, especially under Chief Larry McKinley, we have been infusing the cops policing theory as a way of doing business in the Gary Police Department. So that really did not change the way that we did business in Gary.
I hear different things from different departments that they've at times have been very strong in community policing, and then at other times they've gotten away from it. You're saying that Gary itself has always been very strong. And what differentiates community policing over just good beat work policing, being out there?
Well, community-oriented policing really focuses on your relationship with the community when there is not a crisis. So what happens between the police and community when there's not a hot call, when there's not a really tense situation? And it's our position that what happens when the police are not called is what dictates how they are received when there is a need to call them and whether they're called or not. And so, how often does the police interact with children? How often do the police interact with community groups? What type of programs is your police department involved in? And as an example,
give me some examples of some things that are actually being done in Gary.
We've had the Explorers program, which is similar to scouting, but it is run by the police department. It gets young people who might be interested in a career in policing involved in volunteer efforts with the police in the community. We've had the Police Athletic League forever. I mean, that is the crux or the basis for our youth boxing program in the city of Gary.
So getting involved with kids. But what about the community as a whole?
The community as a whole. We have National Night Out. It's a huge acknowledgement on an annual basis, which is a part of a national effort. In addition to that, we also have forums, community forums. Every month, the police are in some district explaining how they work, hearing from residents about what their specific concerns are, encouraging them to formulate block clubs and neighborhood watches. And that all preceded the unrest that we saw in Ferguson, Staten Island, and the heinous killings of the police in New York.
And what was we haven't really spoken on this topic since then. What was your thought when you saw those officers turn their back on the mayor of New York during the officer's funeral?
Well, my concern was that this was an officer's funeral, and I would not have wanted to do anything or see them do anything to really mar the celebration and the commemoration of those officers' lives. Certainly, I understand the frustration that officers feel when they don't believe that they're getting support. At the same time, I know that Mayor de Blasio was leading and involved in a very difficult conversation, and it's really a balancing, and that's one of the things that we talked about at the Conference of Mayors when we unveiled our report there.
It seems like it's incredible balancing act. Looking at a poll from Reuters showing that really across the board, including the African Americans, that a majority of people think the police are doing their job.
That is absolutely the case. In fact, we did a Zogby poll that found the same thing. Now, there's a differentiation in terms of, in the case of our poll, we found that 60% of white Americans believed that, in fact, the police were doing their job and they had confidence. In terms of Latinos, it was a little less. In terms of African Americans, it was even much more or less, but it was still more than 50%.
Still a majority. But then on the other side of this, then you look at the African American community, the Hispanic community, and ask them whether they think that minorities are a target of the police, and the numbers shoot up there.
Absolutely.
So there's also a tremendous amount of distrust, even while people are thinking that police are doing their basic job of police work, going out there and getting bad guys. So how do you navigate that?
Well, the way that you navigate it is through training, through recruiting the right officers, through really improving the communications with the community. Tell them if you're going to engage in some new tactic in terms of law enforcement. Tell them that they have an open line of communication with officers, and tell them how that might happen. Our hotline, the crime tip lines are important. All of those things are important, and it's extremely important to say to the community that you acknowledge that some of them have trust issues, or some of the community members have trust issues with the police, and you talk to them specifically about what their concerns are and how you might in fact improve the trust.
Several months ago, the Washington Post found that Gary was one of those communities where the demographics of the police department did not match up with the demographics of the community. Is race a component in this? I mean, do you need a police force that matches the demographics of the community to be able to do community policing effectively and earn that trust, more to the point?
So let me say first that the fact that the demographics in Gary don't necessarily match up is a good thing, because it supports the fact that we have a diverse department. But race does play into this. So let me answer the issue in the Washington Post. Gary is a 90% African American city. I don't think that it would benefit Gary to have a 90% African American police force. And so to the extent that we have approximately 65% African American, we have about 30% white, and white Americans, and then we have the remaining in Latino officers. I think that's a good mix for the city of Gary. Certainly we want to recruit more officers. My focus, quite frankly, is on local officers and encouraging officers to move into the community. As it relates to race and the role that it plays, I think that the Post article really focused on those communities that had such a disparity, where you had a 90% white American officer police force, and then you had a 80% African American community. That is, I think, and people have seen, a recipe for trouble in most instances. Now, the way that you resolve that is really through recruitment efforts, and you have to start early on. But while that recruitment is kicking in, because officers don't come on and retire in 5 years or even 10 years. Most officers are there for 20 years. And so in the interim, you have to make sure that you have the right officers in the department, that they are doing the right things, that they have the right training, and that if they do act in an inappropriate way, that you address that behavior immediately.
I just wanted to ask, I mean, what have you learned being chairman of this committee?
You know, you always learn as you lead, and I think that's extremely important. So I've learned that police chiefs, because this was a committee of mayors and police chiefs, are just as concerned about this issue as we are. I've also learned that there's not this big divide as some would believe, because you have the situation in New York with the officers turning their back on Mayor de Blasio, and you have some dissension in other departments across the country. Mayors and police chiefs are essentially on one page about this. And I learned that, as with many things in life, that communication is the key to trusting or building trusting relationships.
Well, for right now, that's where we're going to leave it. Gary Mayor Karen Freeman-Wilson, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me.